Welcome everyone to HSAA's Union Talk Speaker Series. Tonight is our third installment of the series, and we will be discussing the topic labor standards in Alberta. My name is Scott McDougall. I'm a mental health therapist at St. Therese Psychiatric Facility in St. Paul and a Northern Board member for HSAA. For those watching this event via live stream, we encourage you to send in your questions as we go. After the talk, we will have some time for question and answer, and our speaker will do his best to answer all of your questions. Tonight we have with us Dr. Bob Barnetson of Athabasca University. Bob is a professor of labor relations. His research focuses on political economy of workplace injury, farm workers, and child labor in Alberta. He's the author of The Political Economy of Workplace Injury in Canada, co-editor of Farm Workers in Western Canada, Injustices and Activism, and co-author of Health and Safety in Canadian Workplaces. Welcome, Bob.
Oh, gosh. You might want to see how it goes before you do any kind of applause, right? You give that some thought. So good evening, I'm Bob, and I do teach labor stuff up at Athabasca University, and I'm here tonight to talk about labor standards, which sounds just a teeny bit boring, doesn't it? But it's not. It's very exciting. It's got all of the hallmarks of a good HBO series, right? There's conflict, there's going to be some swearing, maybe some violence, and we see how it plays out, but maybe even some nudity. So labor standards. Give me some labor standards. You all know what labor standards are. Give me some examples. Hours of work. Excellent. Part of the Employment Standards Code. What else? Very important. Vacation. Yes, absolutely. Also, Employment Standards Code. Parental leave. Oh, that's very nice. Yes, excellent answer. How about health and safety? That sound like a labor standard to you? Maybe an important thing to have in our workplaces? Anybody else? The rules around collective bargaining and unionization. Those are labor standards, right? In a broad sense. And so is workers' compensation. So I'm going to see if this works. Ooh. In my mind, labor standards are all of the laws and the rules and the policies that governments have enacted to make our lives a little bit better in the workplace, right? At least putatively to make our lives a little bit better. And there are things that fall, these are the usual categories that I think of them, the legislative categories: employment standards, labor relations, health and safety, workers' comp, and human rights. Because we take these laws for granted, it's often really hard to think about what our lives would be like if we didn't have these labor standards. But I'd put to you that they'd be pretty lousy looking back historically. So let's talk about workplace safety. That's a really important set of rights in Alberta, and it's the one I write about most often. So it's the one I'm obviously the most interested in talking about. Alberta has a really good set of occupational health and safety laws, right? Employers have to go out and identify hazards and control them. We have a right to refuse unsafe work, and if things are going badly, we can call a health and safety inspector. The inspector can order remedial work, issue a stop work order, issue fines. I mean, that sounds like arguably a pretty good set of labor standards around health and safety. And if you get injured, you get immediate, predictable, and stable compensation from the Workers' Compensation Board, probably. Right? So you got a pretty good set of labor standards there. The real question for me is, do they actually work? Right, and that's really what labor standards always come down to. When the rubber meets the road, do labor standards work? And I'd put to you that our workplaces are likely safer with these labor standards than they would be if we didn't have them. But that doesn't mean they're necessarily all that safe. There's a very high level of occupational injury in Alberta. So officially, there are 45,000 disabling injuries in Alberta. So a disabling injury, that's kind of WCB speak. That's somebody who couldn't go to work the next day because they got hurt so bad, or they could go to work, but they needed modified duties. So 45,000 injured workers a year. Those are pretty serious injuries, right? That's not just something you're going to walk off. A disabling injury is a pretty serious one. Governments, well, that's okay, man. Governments don't like to talk about the number of injured workers that we have in Alberta. Because when you see 45,000, your first thought is, holy hell, I thought we had good workplace health and safety rules here in Alberta. I thought we had safe workplaces, right? I thought we had an effective health and safety system. And then you're thinking, oh my God, is my workplace safe? Or my partner's workplace, or the place where my kids work, are those workplaces safe? And no, They're not actually safe. And now you've got some skin in the game and you're thinking about what can I do, right? Should I take some action in my workplace to make it safer? And that isn't what employers want. Employers want you to just be quiet and do your damn job, right? And that isn't what the government wants. The government wants you to think things are actually doing pretty good. You know, we have good health and safety standards. So instead of talking about these numbers of injured workers, the governments present injury data as a rate. So many injuries per so many units of work. Right? So in Alberta, the disabling injury rate is 2.36 disabling injuries per 100 person years of work. I deal with injury data all day long. I don't know, that sounds pretty good to me. Like I have no idea what that means until you do the math and you go, oh my God, 45,000 people got seriously hurt in Alberta last year. Right? So there are really good uses for rates. I'm going to use a rate later on in an appropriate way, but I would put to you that governments use rates like this to obscure the fact that our workplaces are profoundly unsafe. And in many ways, our labor standards don't actually work all that well. Now, 45,000 injuries, that sounds like a lot of injuries. But the thing about that stat is that it actually, where'd it go? Anyways, oh, down at the bottom. The thing about that stat is it actually excludes more injuries than it includes. There are way more injured people in Alberta, right? This is workers' compensation claims data is where this number, this 45,000 roughly comes from. Those are injuries where there was a claim that was made and it was accepted. So people who are outside the ambit of the Workers' Compensation Act, about 7 to 10%, their injuries aren't in that number. People who file a claim and get their claim rejected, maybe 5 to 10%, they're not in that number. But the most important exclusion are injuries that workers and employers fail to report. So what is the true number of disabling injuries in Alberta? Well, it's actually pretty stunning. It's 170,000 disabling injuries in Alberta each year. Basically 1 in 11 workers gets injured so badly they either can't go to work the next day or they need modified duties. This data comes from a 2016 study that the government of Alberta funded, probably much to their regret, but anyways, they did fund it, of 2,000 Alberta workers. And what it showed us is that only 30% of workers who are injured seriously bother to file a workers' compensation claim, which kind of sits awkwardly with this notion that workers will exaggerate their injuries and malinger, right? What we know from the data is that most workers don't even bother to report serious injuries, right? And this also almost exactly mirrors a 2002 study. So it's not an anomalous result. So if you tally up all the injuries in Alberta, not just the disabling injuries, but all the injuries, minor ones, a laceration or a burn you might get in a restaurant, all the way up to fatalities. Anyone want to guess what the true number is annually? I hear somebody say 300? 3? So, yeah, okay. Okay, so the number we have, and this is what is 408,000 injured workers. But of course, a worker might get more than one injury. So the actual number of injuries might be much higher than that. It might well be over 1 million. And of course, there's going to be underreporting of injuries. People forget, you know, you get burnt or cut in a restaurant job, you don't even remember that the next day, right? That's just part of doing business. So it's 408,000 injuries, which is 1 in 5 workers being injured each year, which is it's an appalling level of pain and suffering in Alberta workplaces. And what it tells us is that Alberta's injury prevention system doesn't actually work all that well, right? So why don't labor standards like health and safety work? Well, there's a couple of reasons. A part of the problem is there's a very basic and fundamental conflict of interest between what employers want and what workers want. Workers basically don't want to get injured on the job, right? A pretty reasonable ask, right? Employers are under pressure to maximize the profit that they realize from their undertaking. And if you're in the public sector, like most of us are, you see a similar dynamic where employers, managers face a lot of pressure to minimize their expenditures. It drives the same kind of cost containment dynamic. So, and that fundamental conflict of interest, and I can see some of you are skeptical about that because it sounds a little Marxist and this is Alberta, but that fundamental conflict of interest is in fact why we have labor standards, right? If employers were going to treat us how they'd like to be treated, we wouldn't need labor standards, but they don't, so we do. Right? That's how employment works. In terms of workplace safety, what happens is that employers trade your health for their profit. Basically, it's cheaper for employers to operate unsafely than it is to operate safely. And we all see this when our employers run consistently short-staffed, right? You've all seen that in your workplaces where there should be 5 people on and there's only 3 or 4, right? There's not enough bodies. So what do, right? And that's a predictable problem that employers could solve. So what you do is you pitch in, right? So you don't take your breaks, or you lift a patient by yourself, right? Or maybe you're sick, but you come in anyways, even though you probably want the time off because you don't want to screw your colleagues, and you get injured. And on the surface, it's almost like it's your fault, right? Like you lifted that patient unsafely. That's your fault. But that's not the real root reason. The root reason is the employer understaffed your unit, right? And that's about minimizing the cost of the employer. In other industries, you see other patterns, right? Unsafe materials or unsafe work practices. Maybe most notoriously, we talk about asbestos. Employers have known asbestos is dangerous for 100 years, and they've simply denied it. They've told us it's not injurious. They've concocted studies that tell us it's not dangerous. They've hidden evidence. They've bought off politicians. And all the while, thousands and thousands of workers and their families die from horrible asbestos-related diseases, right? That's not all that different than what the tobacco industry does. And I know that's pretty concerning to hear about your employer, but that is the dynamic many, many workers face in the workplaces. And employers often scoff at this kind of analysis, right? They say they know that safety pays. Pretty clearly that's bullshit, right? So if employers are profit-driven and safety pays, how many injuries are you going to see? Like none, right? If safety paid, there wouldn't be any injuries. But what we in fact see is 408,000 injuries, right? That tells you what pays is not working safely, is working unsafely. And it's because the cost of working unsafely can be externalized, right? It gets externalized onto us in the form of injuries, right? That we suck up and we go to work anyways. There's no cost to the employer of that when we show up and do our jobs. It gets externalized onto our families who have to support us when maybe we can't take joy in the non-work activities we might like to because something bad's going on at work, right? We're getting harassed, or we just can't go back and face it one more day. It gets externalized onto taxpayers in the form of healthcare costs or income support programs. And if we do file a WCB claim, we're amongst the 30% of people who file a WCB claim, the cost of that injury gets externalized onto all the other employers in the rate group. There's no economic incentive for employers to prevent injuries, and they don't, right? So given all that, if the whole reason that we have labor standards is to kind of mediate those conflicting interests that employers and workers have, I mean, that raises the pretty obvious question of how did we get labor standards in the first place, right? Because employers obviously aren't going to go along with anything that raises their cost in my particular analysis. Well, I mean, the short answer is we won those standards, right? We, workers, forced governments to accommodate our interests. However imperfectly they've accommodated those interests by threatening to disrupt society and the economy if they didn't. So let's move from health and safety into workers' compensation, because that's the best example about winning rights, right? Workers' comp is our longest surviving set of labor standards, almost 100, I think it's 100 years old in Alberta this year or maybe last year. And basically injured workers get stable, predictable, and immediate compensation for their injuries. It's not all gravy, right? We had to give up our right to sue employers for negligence in order to get that. But overall, that's the deal with workers' compensation. It came about 100 years ago in Ontario. You think about the Canadian Industrial Revolution that was going on, where workers were entering factories, they were unsafe, they were getting injured, and then they were getting tossed out on the street. And sure, they could sue their employers, but very rarely would they win because the tort system is stacked against individuals. And if they did win, their employer would just declare bankruptcy and they'd never see the money. So you think about that kind of dissatisfaction if you're a worker who has to go to work in a factory because there's no other job, and you know it's dangerous and you know you're going to get hurt, and then you get hurt and then you're out on your ear, right? You got to think about that period of time as a time of revolution, right? People were interested in different economic and political ideas and formulations. It was a time of communism, right? The Communist Revolution, 1917. Having a motivated and a sympathetic group of workers with frankly nothing left to lose was a significant source of social instability in Ontario at that time. The kind of thing that can lead to an electoral defeat for a government, or a strike, or a riot, or rich people hanging from lampposts. right? It's that kind of threat to social stability. So to manage that growing discontent, the government of Ontario struck a royal commission headed by William Meredith, and he went around the province and went, oh, geez, injury's bad, and came up with a set of principles, the Meredith principles, which is basically how workers' compensation runs today. It led to our workers' compensation system, except back then they called it workmen's compensation because, you know, ladies, no luck for you. Also, if you're Italian, no luck for you, right? But some workers got some forms of compensation. And if you think about that revolutionary slogan that you have nothing left to lose but your chains, well, one way to think about workers' compensation is it did give workers something to lose, gave them benefits that could be lost. And in that way, it diverts the potential for open class conflict into a much more manageable dispute resolution system, right? That's very technical and bureaucratic in nature. So if you know anything about WCB appeal processes, has anybody witnessed one or knows of somebody who's gone through a WCB appeal? Yeah, okay, a few shaking heads. Yeah, so you know that they're complicated and they go on forever and they sap workers' will to persist. Sometimes they sap workers' will to live, right? And occasionally a worker will go to a WCB building and blow their brains out or take hostage, right? That's not an accident. That is a design feature of workers' compensation. It tries to contain conflict and push that conflict down onto an individual worker. So the stability of workers' compensation, because it's been over 100 years, emanates from the fact that everybody kind of gets something, right? Workers, we get benefits, probably, if we get injured. Employers, they get a liability shield. Government, they get social stability, right? And over time, the compromise has shifted a little bit, sometimes for the better, right? More people get included in workers' compensation over time. New injuries get accepted as compensable. And sometimes it's shifted in a little bit more of a negative perspective. You think about how WCBs have moved away from the concept of no-fault compensation through developing a culture of claims denial. We got workers. So the key thing to remember about workers' compensation is we didn't get it because the government cared about us. We didn't get it because employers cared about us, right? That they were maiming and killing us. In fact, neither the government nor employers did anything to actually make workplaces much safer until a wave of strikes in the 60s and the 70s, right? Which is 50 years after workers' compensation came into place. We got workers' compensation because we were scary. Workers were scary, right? We threatened the interests of government. We threatened the interests of capitalists, of employers, and they decided it was easier to throw us a bone than to throw down with us, right? And we had to fight again in the 1970s to get reasonable compensation for women and for members of certain cultural groups. The best documented case, the reason I said Italians earlier, is Italian construction workers in Toronto who were accused of having spaghetti back and denied compensation, right? So we had to fight to get those people compensation. And as soon as union militancy and unionized density started to decline in the 1980s, employers were right back at the door, pushing back on the benefits that workers could get. And the lesson here is that militancy around labor standards matters, both in good times and in bad, because as soon as we take our foot off the gas, the employer is starting to push governments to roll back our employment standards. And that has obvious implications for us with a provincial election in the offing, right? The Conservative Party has openly talked about rolling back labor standards, right? And reintroducing a two-tier minimum wage, getting rid of farm worker rights, rolling back the rules around union organizing and collective bargaining. Regardless of who gets elected, it's really up to us to put pressure on governments to ensure that the idea of rolling back labor standards is political poison and something they're best to forget about. So I just need a drink of water here. So the discussion we had about workers' compensation raises questions about just who benefits from labor standards, right? Because on the surface, you think workers benefit, right? A good way to tackle that question is actually to look at the pay before you pump legislation that Alberta enacted in order to prevent workers from being injured during gas and dash events. That was, I think, it came into effect in June of 2018. And it was just in the media last week. Anybody see the journal coverage on that? Yeah, a few heads, okay. So the rules were triggered by two 2015 deaths of gas station workers. The workers saw drivers peeling out of their gas station without paying. For whatever reason, they jumped in front of those vehicles, they got run down, and they died. When we talk about gas and dash, nobody ever really talks about why workers would do something That, on the surface is actually seems pretty stupid. It's because usually employers are illegally deducting gas drive-offs from their wages, right? That's the thing we don't talk about, that there is an employer root cause around gas and dash deaths. But anyways, those were the two deaths we had in 2015, and there was another one, I think, in 2016. So the government convenes a consultation of employers in the convenience store and gas station industry, labor reps, and academics to find out what should be done. And the discussion at that consultation basically stopped and started with Grant's Law. Grant's Law was a law enacted in BC in 2008 after a gas station worker named Grant got dragged to death over, it was like $11 in gasoline. What Grant's Law required was two things. First, you have to pay before you pump. And second, between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., you either had to have two workers on, or you had to have some kind of barrier between the worker and the customer to reduce the risk of robbery and other kinds of violence. Those robbery prevention, violence prevention provisions actually got watered down at the behest of the convenience store industry later on in the story. But anyways, that was Grant's Law. And employers in Alberta were, quite interestingly, surprising to me, really open to pay before you pump legislation. I was really surprised when we got into that consultation until they started saying, 77% of our stores are already set up for this, so it'd be no big deal for us to flip the switch on. So why haven't you? Well, because if you pay before you pump, you probably don't go in and make impulse buys of chips and pop and chocolate bars, right? So they didn't want to turn that on. It's not in their shareholders' interests to protect their workers by flipping that on. But if the government was going to legislate, everybody had to do it, everybody had to play by those rules. They were like, yeah, okay, we could go along with. So cue legislation and press releases and photo opportunities and all the usual hoopla that goes along with the rollout of a new labor standard, right? What was weird about that whole consultation is that there is no evidence that fuel theft was a significant source of worker injury. Right? There were a spate of deaths. There were two and maybe a third death later on. But gas and dash almost never injures workers, right? So essentially, employers were pushing hard to implement a solution to a problem that, and I'm sure this is totally a coincidence, would also save them money by reducing losses due to fuel theft. But it wouldn't actually protect workers. The consultation raised two other really interesting issues around injury. The first was that the whole gas station and convenience store industry was profoundly unsafe. So between 2010 and 2014, there were 11,000 and change lost time claims, which are really serious injuries in that industry, which is a phenomenal level of injury. And it's all the usual stuff. It's getting hit by an object, overexertion, bodily reactions, right? It's all the usual stuff people get injured by. If you express it as a lost times claim rate, so it's a good use of a rate, the gas station and convenience store industry is 3.5 times more dangerous than the average workplace in Alberta. And it's a crazy high level of injury when you're talking about lost time claims, because they really represent only about 5% of all injuries. Like you said a little while ago, they're a very small minority. So if you blow that out to all the injuries that are likely going on in gas stations, it was like 40,000 a year. So it's a crazy level of injury in gas stations. And yet that whole issue got pushed to the side, and we rolled out pay before you pump legislation, likely because gas and dash was sexy and it was easy to solve, right? Everybody was on board with flipping the switch on pay before you pump. The second issue that came up in that consultation was about violence in the workplace, which is a surprisingly huge issue. So you think back to that time, 2015, there were two Max store employees here in Edmonton who got killed in separate but related incidents. The violence data we got at that consultation was really limited, but it suggested there were 83 assaults between 2011 and 2015 that resulted in a lost time claim injury. So again, probably a huge number of other assaults and violence that didn't result in those injuries. But really, violence was only about 0.7 of 1% of all the lost time claims. It's not a huge, it's bad, but it's not a huge deal in terms of sources of injuries for those workers. The best way to prevent violence is to install a barrier between a worker and a customer, right? It engineers out the possibility of a violent confrontation. If I'm behind glass, you can't get to me. So maybe we should have one here tonight. Anyways, we'll see how this goes. So employers were really highly resistant to the idea of putting barriers in convenience stores and gas stations, right? They said they were ineffective, which is totally not true. They said they were expensive, which is totally true. And they said they're off-putting to customers. So instead, employers argued for so-called violence prevention plans, things like clear sight lines and good lighting and all the stuff that's been going on in gas stations since I was a gas jockey in 1990, right? And these sorts of interventions do reduce the risk of robbery. But the research we have, which is mostly from the US, says that robbery is really only the source of about 20% of the violence that goes on in convenience stores. The rest has no robbery motive. Right? So robbery prevention efforts, which is what the convenience store industry was pushing under the guise of violence prevention, right, won't appreciably reduce the risk of violence to workers, which of course we knew at the time, right, because employers were already doing all of that stuff and people were still getting injured due to violence in the workplace. So why wouldn't employers want to protect their workers from violence? Well, it comes down to cost, right? It costs money to install glass barriers. And as soon as you say an employee has to stay behind that barrier for the totality of their shift, or at least when there's somebody in the store, they can't go make coffee. They can't go mop the floor. They can't go stock. It has huge operational implications for how these stores maximize the work that they extract from their workers. So the outcome of this consultation, and I will wrap up this rambling story, was, and the law that the government enacted was entirely counterfactual, right? Pay before you pump became the law in June of 2018, even though there's no evidence that gas and dash was a significant source of injury. And at the same time, the government took no meaningful steps to protect workers from violence. Instead, employers were required to have plans, which most already did, and which didn't work. So are workers safer? Probably they're a tiny bit safer because of that gas and dash legislation. Although there's some question now, if you followed the news coverage last week, about whether employers are actually complying with the pay before you pump legislation, right? The real winner here were the employers who saved the cost of fuel theft, they saved the cost of having to install barriers, and they ended up looking really good. It's a pretty surprising analysis of, a well-touted labor standard improvement. And the government simply took the path of least resistance on this, right? They created a symbolic win, which doesn't do much to actually protect workers. Remember, the real injury epidemic in convenience stores and gas stations have to do with exertion and contact with objects, and nothing has been done about that. So what that story suggests is two things. First, while workers do benefit from labor standards, they're not the only beneficiaries. Labor standards often benefit other parties. And in fact, workers may not even be the main beneficiary of labor standards, which is a disturbing thing to say, right? And frankly, an unpopular thing to say amongst many of my friends. And second, the exact distribution of benefits from new labor standards depends upon how much power you have in the consultation and the formation of that legislation. The convenience store industry was out in force at that consultation. They had clear talking points and they got exactly what they wanted. Right. So as our time winds down tonight, and my wife was pretty clear that you can only talk for 32 minutes before you lose the room. So this is going to wrap up. I don't know why 32 minutes. That seemed awfully precise as a bit of advice to give me. But anyways, 32 minutes. I'd like to come back to the question of why don't labor standards work all the time? Because it's complicated, it's multifaceted. And as I said, one of the explanations is there is a conflict of interest between workers and employers, right? Over issues like workplace safety. And governments know that to be true. That's why they hire health and safety inspectors and employment standards officers to go out and enforce laws. But there's an open question about whether those inspections actually matter. Do they make any difference for workers? So here's a slide. I hope I didn't skip too many slides. A little bit of history or a little bit of background about Alberta. There's roughly 1.8 million non-managerial employees in Alberta, a little hand waggling. There's about 200,000 employers. There are about 75 employment standards inspectors, which is up appreciably since the NDs came to power. They have made a real effort to hire here, right? So that's one inspector for every 2,600 employers or every 24,000 employees. On an average year, there are about 700 proactive inspections where they go out and they look at an employer, and there is about 1,700 complaints that come in. So those would be all of the inspections, 2,400. So that means a workplace is going to get an employment standards inspection about once every 83 years, which is pretty shocking. It suggests that inspections aren't a huge threat to employers, right? There's not too much red tape impeding employers. And of the workers who do complain about wage theft, the majority don't in fact get their stolen wages back. We see something similar in occupational health and safety. There are about 140 occupational health and safety inspectors. To their credit, they did about 12,000 inspections last year, and then they went back to half of those employers a second time to make sure they actually corrected the deficiencies that got found. So we have an inspection cycle in health and safety of about once every 17 years, right? That's how often you would expect on average an inspection, right? And although there are 170,000 disabling injuries in Alberta each year, there are generally about 20. 20 is a good year for occupational health and safety convictions, right? So on the one hand, we've got governments have inspectors because they know that employers are going to cheat and they're going to break the law. And yet on the other hand, they under-resource those inspectors. So in fact, there's no possible way those poor inspectors can have a meaningful impact on safety or wage theft in our workplaces. And what all this means is that employers have very little chance of being caught breaking the law, right? And if they do get caught, there's little chance they're going to experience a meaningful penalty. Likely what they're going to get is a remediation order. Just do what you should have done in the first place. So if you're an employer and you're out trying to make a buck, you have zero incentive to comply with the laws. In fact, you have a huge incentive not to comply with the laws because you might save a little bit of money and there's no consequence if you get busted. Right? Sure, workers can narc you out, but very few workers will do that because quite rightly they fear that there'll be retaliation and they'll lose their job, which is illegal, but it happens nonetheless. So that the government operates an enforcement system and that workers can but won't complain about violations, it creates this perception about standards that they're enforced and that they're complied with. But in reality, the enforcement system is so lax in Alberta, despite the efforts the NDs have made to beef it up, that it actually encourages violations, which explains why there's so much wage theft and injury. So what are the takeaways here, right? And I know you're only going to remember 4 things. That's at least that's all I'm going to remember out of tonight. So probably you're going to remember 4 things. What are the 4 things you want to remember? I'd say they're these things. First, workers' lives are better with labor standards than they are without. Labor standards concretely benefits each and every one of us, whether we're in a union or we're not. Right? Second, we need to constantly fight to maintain and realize our workplace rights. Employers are really quick to ignore or attack even the most basic of workplace protections, things like minimum wages. I can't believe we're talking about a 2-tier minimum wage yet again, right? And it's easy for governments to let enforcement dwindle to the point that our rights are basically meaningless. And the need to constantly fight reflects those conflicting interests between labor and capital, like I said right at the very beginning. And it reflects that governments more often than not will try to take the least politically costly route out of a problem. The third thing is when we fight, and only when we fight, we usually win. I know that's hard to see in Alberta because things have been so terrible for so long under Conservative governments, but we win as workers. If you think back to when Alison Redford was going after our pensions in, I'm thinking 2013, maybe it was 2014, things get blurry after 5 years out. You know, we fought back. People went and met with their MLAs. We all stood and froze our asses off in Winston Churchill Square in the coldest demonstration I've ever been a part of. And you know what? She backed down. And in fact, a year later, the whole problem that was the pretext for attacking our pensions magically disappeared, like it wasn't real even to begin with, right? So it pays to fight. That's the lesson of 40 years of Conservative rule in Alberta. It pays to fight. And finally, when we fight, it pays to keep in mind that employers also benefit from labor standards and labor rights. So look at that 47% increase in the minimum wage that we got over the last 3 years, right? That's a pretty impressive increase in a minimum wage. At the beginning, employer lobbyists, the restaurant industry, Conservative politicians were like, oh my God, it's the end of the world and there'll be no more restaurants and people will be starving in the streets. And you know what? Things have actually never been better in the restaurant industry in Alberta since they increased the minimum wage, because minimum wage people have to spend all their money to get by and they buy things like food. Right? So fighting back against that employer narrative, which to their credit, unions did an excellent job of supporting the government in that. It really helped set the stage to undercut things like the recent Restaurant Canada campaign for a 2-tier minimum wage, right? That was a huge flop as a policy campaign. And fighting back in smart ways was also really effective, identifying which employers were on board with that, and then encouraging on social media, boycotting those employers. And damn, suddenly, all of a sudden, employers were backpedaling away from that really craven policy that they were trying to have implemented. Same thing with farm worker rights. You know, when Bill 6 first came out, it was the end of the family farm. And what's happened 4 years later? Basically nothing, except paid farm workers aren't dying on farms. None died last year for the first time in recent memory. So anyways, I'm now ranting, which is apparently why my wife decided 32 minutes was probably the limit of how long you wanted to hear me speak. So I'm going to turn, I think, the mic back over to our moderator. If you have questions or comments or speeches disguised as questions, I'd be happy to field all of those things. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. One question we had emailed in tonight was, do the stats you're talking about here tonight also reflect psychological injury in the workplace?
Oh, God. So I would say probably not. Almost no psychological injuries ever get claimed in workers' compensation. I know there are some that are now deemed, not deemed, that's the wrong word, have presumptive status, but for most people, psychological injuries aren't compensable under workers' compensation. So probably they don't include that. So that's another type of underreporting. But I have no way to scope out what that might be. Sir.
Hi, Bob. I was wondering if you knew of any jurisdictions like other provinces, states, or nations that are crushing workplace health and safety and actually doing a much better job than us, that have maybe passed laws that we should be looking at, or that sort of thing, or are we the top of the heap despite everything?
So the answer is not offhand, and I think the underlying issue is most modern occupational health and safety systems are based on the internal responsibility system, right? That workers and employers share responsibility in the workplace to make it safe, and that's based on the assumption that came out of the UK in the late 60s that employers and workers share an interest in safe workplaces. And I actually don't think that's true. Like, it's a fundamentally flawed assumption, and it creates a system that appears to be functional right on the surface, but what you actually see when it plays out is, well, let me talk about my workplace, Athabasca University. Suddenly we're under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, we're a big employer, we've got to have joint health and safety committees because the New Democrats changed the law, and good for them. You know what my employer did? Nothing. My employer didn't strike a health and safety committee. And when we complained about it, you know what they did? Nothing. We complained to the government. You know what the government did? Not much. Finally, 8 months after this was all supposed to have been rolled out, and there was lots of lead time before that, we maybe have health and safety committees, but they're employer-dominated committees, right? They're a joint health and safety committee, but the employer sets the agenda, the employer determines what we talk about, the employer drives the solutions we talk about. It's not a joint system at all, and what we see rolling out is that the employer's interests tend to be the paramount interest, and of course, their interest is in minimizing the cost of health and safety. So the short answer to your question is I don't think anybody's hit upon a better solution. I would put to you, being a part of a union that's now suddenly under the labor code, and suddenly we have the right to strike, which is very exciting. Man, direct action is way more effective at getting the employer to pay the hell attention to our interests than ever going to arbitration or filing complaints with the labor board was. Yeah. So I think direct action, and particularly savvy health and safety representatives who combine technical knowledge and political activism, is the direction forward to make our system better. And that doesn't even really require changes in our laws, although it might be nice if the laws were enforced a little better. So sorry that isn't a more hopeful answer.
Bob, there's a request just to put your stats back up on the screen there from earlier. Any other questions in the room?
Thanks for this, Bob. I'm interested in your statement that labor standards actually benefit employers as well, because most of the examples that you provided, either in those examples, the employers benefited by chance, or like it just so happened that they also, or in fact they benefited because we didn't really implement any real labor standards. So do you have any examples of where employers actually had real benefits, or does it even matter?
So let's go back to the gas and dash example, right? So the employer benefited in 3 ways from that. They avoided costs associated with actually preventing violence, right? They didn't have to install barriers, which would have actually been effective. They gained money by having pay before you pump imposed upon them. So they no longer have fuel theft, right? They're actually using existing technology to the limits of its capacity, and they are benefiting from that because there's no more fuel theft, more or less. And they gained reputationally from that labor standard. So I think those are examples of concrete benefits that were achieved because that industry read the room and went in with a plan and pushed that plan aggressively on the government, who was also looking for a win and went along with that.
But in that situation, you were saying that the workers didn't have any real effective labor standards increase, like the things that actually would have gone to help minimize the lost time,
right? So
we're not implemented.
Yeah, they've seen probably tiny increases, right? There probably will never be another gas and dash death in Alberta, which is a totally laudable outcome that we should all be happy about. But there weren't all that many gas and dash deaths in Alberta over the last 20 years. Period. So it's a pretty marginal increase, and some workers will have slightly safer workplaces around violence and assaults because of the plans that all employers now have to have. But in fact, most employees already benefited from that because the industry was just retreading what they've been doing for 20 or 30 years. So there are marginal gains. I mean, that's an example where employers won big out of a labor standard, which is of course why I chose it.
Bob, another comment from Sherry online. Do you think that small businesses are suffering financially under the changes to the OH&S code?
No. There's no evidence to suggest any relationship between the changes to the OHS code, which in fact were scaled to have somewhat lower requirements, particularly around joint health and safety committees for smaller operations than for larger. I would suggest that many employers have not changed anything about how they address occupational health and safety, despite the changes in the code. When we went out and did our survey of 2,000 Alberta employees, we asked them questions about their employers' compliance with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Only half of employers had done hazard assessments, identified hazards and identified controls, which is really the most rudimentary and basic thing you could do if you wanted to have a safe workplace. Most had done no training for their workers. I think most had done no training for their workers. And there was a third standard that only had about a third compliance. So there is such overall low compliance that raising the standards without also raising enforcement likely will have no net negative effect on small business. If the government actually enforced the law, yeah, there might be some costs. Yeah.
Any other comments in the room?
Hi.
Hey.
I come from a postal worker background, and we have 10 times the injury rate of any federally regulated industry. That with known experience of exactly what you said, employers our employer encouraging employees to apply to short-term disability plan instead of going through the WCB framework, because they might argue and you might not get anything, and this way you get money right away and we can accommodate you in the meantime, such and such and such. And I'm just kind of wondering, and that is in a giant federal company, where you'd expect that the bureaucracy would be a little bit more
balanced.
Yeah, you would get more claims going through WCB because people would know that. I like the fact that you said the government did that study, but I would still, I mean, I'm wondering if there is any other studies or pushes in that direction, because it seems to me that in Alberta, where there's very dangerous private industry that's happening, that encouragement would be a lot higher, if or at all. So all the unclaimed injuries, I feel as though it might be even higher than what that government study put forward. I'm just wondering if there's any movement on that.
Yeah, it could well be. Injury suppression is a pretty well documented phenomena that occurs in all sorts of provinces. There was a study out of Manitoba a little while ago, and it has to do with how WCB is funded. So WCB premiums are levied on employers based on every $100 of payroll. But that doesn't create any incentive for employers to improve safety, because they only see a fraction of the cost savings if they improve safety, because all their competitors still aren't improving safety. So layered over top of that base rate is something called experience rating. So employers can have their premiums increased or decreased based upon the total claims cost that they attribute to the system. And that creates an incentive for employers to pressurize workers to not report injury. And in the last review of the WCB here in Alberta, which was a pretty amazing review overall, the review panel totally took a whiff on experience rating and didn't engage with that topic in any sort of meaningful reform way. I don't really have an answer to your question about that, other than you are right that claims suppression is a significant issue in health and safety.
Bob, there's a follow-up from Sherry again to the first small business question is how do you communicate with small business owners who are anti-NDP who believe they are suffering?
Well, they're not interested in anything I have to say, right? So I don't make any effort to communicate with them. The people who should be communicating with them is, in fact, the government through the occupational health and safety system and through the workers' compensation system. I have a friend who's involved in farm worker rights. He was recently in hospital for an unrelated health problem in a small rural hospital, and was talking to the doctor as they were waiting for some test results. Oh yeah, farm workers are now compensable injuries under WCB. Doctor had no idea, even though doctors have a responsibility to report. There is a tremendous lack of education, and honestly, I don't know how you get through people's filters if they're not interested in hearing news that, you know, might negatively impact their small business. The provocateur in me would suggest that some small business people should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and that might wake up small business owners to their obligations if a couple of them went to jail. But that, you know, is probably not a very popular view with governments who authorize those sorts of prosecutions, so it's unlikely to happen.
Other questions in the room?
Hi, I just want to comment on your point about needing to fight to even maintain the standards, and working for a union. We know that, and we have to do that. And we have a health and safety department here at Health Sciences where we train our members who sit on health and safety committees.
Awesome.
So they know how to push back to employers. So if you want any tips from us for your committee, you'll just let us know.
Thank you very much. We may well be taking you up on that. The employer has declined my participation on our health and safety committee because I'm a teleworker, even though teleworkers are entitled to participate in health and safety committees. So fortunately, I'm off the hook, but I may well take you up on that. Thank you.
Any other thoughts from the room or online?
Well, if not, thank
you.
All right, Jerry.
If there's time and space. So we have an election upon us, likely within a week, and at least the minimum wage, if not, and now Bill 6, we know that the UCP is going to make these election issues. What have you done any thinking about that? What any tips on appropriate ways to fight back at this time right now, as we head into the? Are there things that we as unions should be pushing for to be talked about during the election period that we're not talking about? Like what's burning in your soul about workers' rights that we should be fighting for?
I mean, mostly what's going on in my head is a lot of screaming, right? Because I do fear the negative impact that a UCP government would have on workers' rights, and particularly the rights of the most vulnerable, people who are earning minimum wage and barely getting by, farm workers who would be denied, once again, denied the basic employment rights that every other worker in Alberta has. I have to say, I'm going to vote NDP because I think that is absolutely in my interest as a worker. But man, as a worker, I haven't been super chuffed. There's not been a lot to excite me about the NDP's record on labor. My union's currently bargaining and I'm the strike chair. And it is possible we're going to go out on strike over this 2-0 mandate, mostly because our employer is unrealistic. But the idea that workers can accept wage freezes indefinitely, like we've already taken years of zeros before this mandate from the government came out that you have to take 2 more zeros. It is not exciting my members at all, or interesting them in becoming active in politics, or indeed voting for a government that is their best hope, despite whatever reservations I may have about some of their particular policies. I gotta say, I'm feeling kind of despondent. So I don't know that I have any good advice for unions about what they should be doing, especially given the strictures that you're placed under the new election laws. So no, I don't have an answer for you, but I did stretch that out quite admirably, I thought. Yeah.
Okay. You said the fighting to maintain labor standards is important. Why do you recommend? Why and what do you recommend ways to do that? A second correlate to that is, do you think Alberta unions are doing an adequate job of addressing sexual harassment? So, kind of 2 different ones. If you want to go with the first one first, the fighting to maintain labor standards. Why and what do you recommend the ways of doing that?
Well, the why I say that is because as soon as we take our foot off the gas, the employers start grinding labor standards, right? And they do it often in very subtle ways. What goes on in the workers' compensation system has been astounding, that they have over time co-opted the workers' compensation board such that the default perspective of those staff is that claims are probably not true, right? And it results in an outrageous level of claims denial. And it all comes back to this notion that employers are somehow the ratepayers in the workers' compensation system. So we should curry their favor in that system, which is ridiculous because another way to look at employers' role in that system is they are the perp who is injuring workers, right? And they're getting off pretty lightly by having to actually pay a modest amount of injury premium to support those workers. So I think we do need to always fight back. And it's so easy once a law gets codified to just kind of go, okay, we've dealt with that for now, right? We're on to the next crisis, because obviously unions and activists tend to get overloaded by, the planet's burning kind of crises. How should unions fight back? It takes a lot of effort, speaking from my experience as a unionist, to get members to care about things. It's so easy not to talk about things or to kind of tritely frame things as we had a win on this, right? And then put it away. No, we had a win, but it was only a partial win. And here's what we need to do to keep going, right? It's hard to keep motivated like that, but that is the kind of constant attention that employers put to their policy objectives, right? They have a lot of money and they have staff to do that. But that's the kind of strategy that I think is more effective in the long term, but I appreciate there are limits to that. The sexual harassment question, could you repeat the question so I answer the right one?
Yeah, sure. It says, do you think Alberta unions are doing an adequate job of addressing sexual harassment?
No, I mean, obviously the answer is no. Even if I thought differently, obviously the answer to that would be no. And I don't know that it's necessarily entirely up to unions, but unions certainly would be an important conduit for unionized workers to receive some sort of redress for the sexual harassment. And yet that forces unions to look inside and address the sexual harassment that goes on within unions, right? Like, we're not blameless as union leaders either. It's a really difficult issue, but the short answer is no, unions could obviously do more. That wasn't meant as a slag at unions. I just wanted to recognize that we do need to kind of clean up our own houses as well.
Have you done any research into the changes that happen with how organizing happens for unions? Because I know that that was a very important piece for changes within labor that hugely are helping places that want to organize and become unions to be able to do so.
Right. So you're talking about card check unionization. Yeah. So the only data I've seen was about a year ago. CBC, Kim Trinacity did a story about this. And the first year we had card check saw a huge jump in the number of union certification drives, as well as the success rate, which when you look at the research about card check versus mandatory vote, whenever they introduce card check, that happens. You know, there's more organizing and it's more successful because employers have no opportunity under card check to go and put a chill on the vote and basically tank the union, right? And as soon as they go back to mandatory vote, you see an equally large drop off in the number of organizing campaigns and the success rate. I haven't seen year 2 data because I don't think we're quite at the end of year 2, but I think that was a really significant win, especially coupled with things like first contract arbitration and remedial certification. Essentially, the NDs did a great job in taking away all of the incentives employers have that the NDs could affect to resist workers exercising their right, free from undue influence, to decide whether they want to be represented or not. That was a really huge win, and it's one that Kenny has talked quite explicitly about reversing. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's a shame.
No further questions or comments, Bob, but thanks very much. It was very good presentation tonight and some stuff that I had not known before either. So.
Well, thank you very much for listening so patiently for all those 32 minutes, and I will report back to my wife that she was right.
Just a reminder to everyone here and online that the video of tonight's event will be up in a few days on our events page at hsaa.ca and on the Facebook page as well. Please feel free to share the video with others who couldn't join tonight. And just a reminder that the next speaker series event is Wednesday, March 27th at the Calgary HSAA office. We have Ian Hussey of the Parkland Institute joining to speak about Alberta's economy and budget, what we have, what we could have. Hope to see you then.